Amen. First of all, who can describe for me a miracle? We talked about the definition of a miracle last week. Who can give me a definition of a miracle? Unnatural. Okay. Beyond nature. Supernatural. Something that cannot occur naturally. So it's supernatural. A sign is another way to describe a miracle because it points to the person and the message that is the person performing it for the purpose of getting the people's attention and to focus in on that message. The miracles had a purpose, and the purpose was to verify and confirm Jesus was who He claimed to be, and then to verify and confirm that the apostles were His chosen representatives. And once the New Testament was written and the completed will of God was written down, those miracles were to come to an end because their purpose of confirming would have been complete. We believe in Jesus based upon the miracles we read about. These things are written, John said, that you might believe. So faith comes by God's Word, not by what we see with our eyes or experience in our own life. So the miracles recorded in the Bible are enough for us to believe in God, believe in Jesus. And John focuses in on 7 miracles, and we're going to look at the miracle of feeding 5,000. And we see here, He is, if you see that little chart on page 61, we looked at Jesus turning water into wine. He's master of matter and quality. We talked about wine and what it was according to that context. It was nothing intoxicating. It was not alcoholic in nature. It was something that was called good wine. And we talked about that last week. When He healed the nobleman's son in John chapter 4, He's master of distance and space. He did not have to even be there. Shows that He was master over the disease, but also He did not have to be there and lay hands on him or touch him for the miracle to take place. The healing of the lame man, John chapter 5, He's a master of time. And therefore, He was able to heal that individual. What we're seeing here is feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. He is master of quantity. Master of quantity. He has the power over the material world. And we're going to see that as we look at this. Let's go into John chapter 6. We'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 15. This miracle is also recorded in Mark chapter 6 and in Luke chapter 9, as you have the references there on page 60 of your study guide. John chapter 6 and verse 1 says, "After these things Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias." Same sea, 2 different names. "Then a great multitude followed Him because they saw His signs which He performed on those who were diseased." Now it's very interesting as you start out this chapter. You see here in chapter 2, great multitudes are following Him. But now look at the end of the chapter, verse 66. "From that time, many of His disciples went back and walked with Him no more." Starts out with great multitudes, then ends up with many walking with Him no more. And it was because of what Jesus was teaching. And it was because they were concerned about what's about to happen here and not really His teachings and being a true disciple. So they followed Him because they saw the signs which He performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there He sat with His disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near, and Jesus lifted up His eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward Him, He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this He said to test Him, for He Himself knew what He could do. Notice, he is asking a question not to get knowledge or get an answer to a dilemma from Philip. He knew what he was going to do, but he was testing Philip. Verse 7, Philip answered and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here, a young man, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? Then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. That's just the men. That's just the men in number, about 5,000. Verse 11. Jesus took the bread, or the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to his disciples, and the disciples to those eating, sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. Verse 12. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, and with which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this truly is the prophet who is to come into the world. Therefore, verse 15, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come to take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, verse 15 proves that the Jews would have had Jesus as an earthly king. The theory that says Jesus came to be an earthly king and the Jews just rejected him, and therefore he couldn't set up his kingdom and he postponed it to the end of time, is false. Look, they were going to take him by force and make him king. Now, why do you think after this miracle of feeding 5,000, they said, we want him to be king? One of the hardest things to do is supply your army. Here's a man, they've already seen him heal diseases, so he could heal their injured in an army. Here's a man that can multiply food for that many people. They're thinking this would be an unstoppable king. So they wanted him for an earthly king. But Jesus said in John 18 and verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. It's not of this world. Therefore, they had the concept of him being an earthly king and wanted to make him an earthly king. When he found out about that in verse 15, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. He didn't want to have any part of that. He was not here to be an earthly king. Now, notice the miracle also, as we look at this. The people were already out. The people were there to have the people healed. The people were also out to hear his teaching. Then a need arose, and Jesus provided for that need. The point that I'm making in this is that Jesus did not provide food to get people to come hear him. He did not have food, say, come and eat, then I'll teach you. They came to him, drawn by his power, the miracles that they witnessed, heard his teaching. He provided for them because there was a need. The point is, he was not using food as a gimmick. There are so many religious people who use food as a gimmick to get people to listen to their message. And they'll provide food. We'll provide a hot meal for you. Come to this place and eat, and then after they're there, they're going to give them their message. That's not how Jesus operated. He did not provide a gimmick to draw people in. They were already there, and they needed to eat. And it wasn't as easy as it is for us to go down the street to a fast food restaurant to eat. I mean, it was an ordeal, especially for that large of people, to come up with food. And so Jesus was providing a need. We should never use food or anything as a gimmick to get people to listen to our message. And when I say our message, I mean God's message, the message we are preaching. We should be preaching the message and let the message draw people in. That's why when we have Friends and Family Day and we have the invitations to invite people to Friends and Family Day, we don't even put on the invitation, we're going to have a meal. And we should never use our fellowship meal as a draw for people. They should come here to hear the gospel, and if they're here to hear the gospel, you can eat with us. That's fine. It's great to have you. We'd love to have you eat with us. But if we say we're going to provide a meal, we want you to come here and hear the gospel, then we'll eat together, get a free meal. To me, that's using a gimmick. That's using something other than the gospel to get people's attention and to draw them in. Jesus didn't operate that way. The apostles did not. The early church did not. He was meeting a need here. The reason why I bring this up is because so many people point to this when they say, you know, we should have a big fish fry, or we should have a barbecue and invite people of the community out. Then that gives us an opportunity to spark up conversations about the gospel. That's a gimmick. Jesus never operated that way. It was a need that needed to be met, and He did. Now look at our study guide there on page 60. The fourth miracle, feeding 5,000. He gives the scriptures there listed. He said the location is on the grassy plain near the shore of the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, about 4 miles around the sea from Capernaum. Those present, Jesus, the multitude, His disciples, especially Philip and Andrew, and the lad. Those are the ones that are involved in this account. The need. Jesus said, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? There was a need there for them to eat. The miracle, 5,000 men, besides the women and children. Eastern custom did not permit the women to sit with men. So it was a bigger number than 5,000. It was 5,000 men plus. Fed with a little boy's lunch consisting of 5 barley loaves, which was like a large cracker. That's the type of consistency that bread would be. And 2 small fish, about like sardines. Therefore, 1 cracker for each 1,000, and 1 fish for 2,500. 12 baskets of fragments were collected so as to have no waste. Now, why do you think 12 baskets? 12 disciples, 12 apostles. Each one can carry a meal home with them. See, there's a purpose. God doesn't do anything wasteful. Jesus did not do anything wasteful. That's why He said, take up the fragments that are left. He says in verse 12, gather up the fragments that remain so that there is nothing is lost. You know, that should be a lesson to me and our family and every family here, that we shouldn't be wasting food. And we are guilty of it, and I think every family is, throwing away food. When there are people in the world who are starving to death, who barely have enough just to get by, and we'll take 2 or 3 bites out of something and then throw it in the trash. That's a shame, brethren. And I'm guilty of it just as much as others are. I think that we should be better stewards. Better stewards of the blessing God gives us. And teach that to our children as well, to be better stewards, so that nothing is lost. And so in verse 13, they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets. You have 12 apostles. So each basket for an apostle. The result of this miracle, the miracle had a purpose. They said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 18. In your Bible there, it has prophet with a capital P. That means the translators were saying this is the prophet. Not just a prophet. This is the prophet that was to come into the world that Moses spoke of. Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 18. Here's what Moses says, Deuteronomy 18 and verse 18. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall come to pass that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. You remember what the religious leaders of the Jews asked John the Baptist earlier in the book of John? Are you the Messiah? No. Are you the prophet? No. He was a prophet, but he was not the prophet that Moses is speaking of here. And Peter speaks of him in Acts chapter 3. The prophet. The people who do not listen to this prophet will be cut off. They will, in other words, they will be punished. He is the prophet that we are to listen to. He's prophet, priest, and king. All three offices in one person, Jesus Christ. Now, his prophet, he being the prophet, he was to be listened to. He was a prophet like Moses, as the prophecy says there in Deuteronomy chapter 18. In what ways did the life of Moses foreshadow the life of Jesus Christ? And in what ways he liked the prophet Moses? Think about him all the way back to his infancy. Very good. Both of their lives were in danger in infancy. Remember, the Hebrew boys were to be cast into the Nile with the crocodiles, to be destroyed under Pharaoh's rule. And that's how he got put in that little ark and providentially saved by God, then brought into the Pharaoh's family. Jesus, as an infant, was in danger. Herod. Moses was rejected by his brethren initially. Jesus was despised and rejected by his own family members as well. They performed signs. Moses was given signs to prove and verify he was the prophet of the one true living God before Pharaoh. And then, of course, the 10 plagues on Egypt. Jesus performed signs. That's what we're studying. To verify that He is the Son of God. And so there's so many others. Moses, the covenant, came through Moses. Jesus is the covenant giver of the new covenant. He shed His blood to bring about the new covenant that we have in our Bible, the New Testament. God's will for the church. So there are many parallels and foreshadowing of Jesus in the life of Moses. That's a very interesting study sometime that you can do. And you can look at the life of Moses. You can get a piece of paper and divide it in half and just list some things about Moses. And on the other side, list some things about Jesus and see how they parallel one another. Also, John chapter 6. We're going to see Jesus walking on the water. The fifth miracle that's recorded by John. Walking on the water. This is going to show Jesus is master of gravity and natural law. But you think about the miracle of feeding the feeding of the 5,000, he had to duplicate what was there, miraculously duplicate what was there to provide for that multitude. That doesn't happen naturally. That can't happen naturally. So he has authority over the material universe and the material realm, the matter itself. He can duplicate matter. Now we're going to see he has power over the natural realm. As we look at John chapter 6, beginning in verse 16, that's supposed to be 21 there in the book, but he forgot the 1 there in the scripture reference. John chapter 6, verse 16 through 21. Says, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land they were going. So really, what you see here is 2 miracles when you read carefully. 2 miracles. Jesus was not with them in the boat, and he was walking on the water. There arose a great wind, and in that area, when you study the geography there, even to this very day, storms would come on the Sea of Galilee very easily, and they would make the sea just churn. It would be a very dangerous situation. The way the winds would come off of the mountains, and the geography of that area was just ripe for storms to suddenly arise. And Jesus, not with them in the boat on this occasion, was seen walking toward them. Well, again, that's unnatural. Now, I know that I've seen magicians on television try to walk on water, and of course they have trickery and sleight of hand, and what they do is something that is a trick. It's not miraculous. There's no power to it, and it's an illusion. But what Jesus was actually doing here was something that was unnatural. It was a miracle. He has power over gravity. He has power over these things. He created them. John chapter 1. He created these things, so he has power over them. And they were afraid. Of course, other accounts talk about how they thought that they were seeing a spirit, and that was a natural reaction. He says, it is I, do not be afraid. And then in verse 21, they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So there's another miracle. Immediately there, at that place, transportation from one place to another, miraculously. You know, we see that in the book of Acts. I believe that you see that in the end of the book of Acts. You see that with Philip and the eunuch. After Philip baptizes the eunuch, it says the Holy Spirit, caught away Philip, that the Ethiopians saw him no more. And then he was found somewhere else preaching. Miraculous transportation. That would have been a sign, of course, to the man who was just converted. And it would be something to strengthen his faith. We saw that Satan was able to do that. God allowed Satan to have that power when he tempted Jesus, right? He took him up on the high mountain. Then he took him up to the pinnacle of the temple. That had to be a miraculous transportation, because you just can't go from those points. Satan took him. Well, Satan's a spiritual being. So there had to be some miraculous supernatural activity going on there. Of course, God allowing that to happen. So here we have the miraculous transportation going on. You know, we dream about those things and we talk about them in things like Star Trek, the transporter beaming down to point A to point B. And you know, man thinks in his technology he can do that. But here's God just with His power, transporting people, multiplying food, walking on the water, just simply because He is divine. Not with technology that He had to build, but out of His own being, His own power. Okay, number 5, the 5th miracle, walking on the water. John chapter 6, Matthew chapter 14, Mark chapter 6. The location, the Sea of Galilee. Those present, Jesus and His disciples, especially Peter. In the other accounts, it focuses in on Peter. The need, Jesus was on the mountain, but the disciples, having rowed about 3 or 4 miles, with the sea becoming turbulent, and it being sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., were going on their way to Capernaum. The other ones give the time reference. Matthew and Mark give the time reference there, between 3 and 6 a.m. in the early morning. The miracle, Jesus appeared in the midst of the storm, walking on the water, the law of gravity becoming inverted, and the wind ceased. Well, there again is the calming of the storm. Upon speaking the words of reassurance, they received Him and immediately reached the shore. The result, the disciples were amazed and worshiped Him. The other accounts talk about they worshiped Him. This brought about worship when they saw that He has this divine power. And so we see here that this sign caused them to recognize His divinity as the true Son of God. Now, as before we get into this 6th miracle, you see how, I touched on this at the very beginning of the lesson. You see how people can go from one way of thinking to another in a very short period of time. Great multitudes were following Him, verse 2 of John chapter 6. They saw the signs He performed on those who had diseases. They had a need. He fed them. It impressed them so much. Verse 15, they were about to come and take Him by force and make Him king. That miracle so impressed Him that they wanted to make Him king. And look at verse 22. On the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that one which His disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered that boat with His disciples, but His disciples had gone away alone. However, the other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. Then the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor His disciples. They also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. Why? They want to make Him king. They got an offer for Him that we'll follow you. We want you to be our king. So very impressed. And in verse 25, they found Him on the other side of the sea. They said to Him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Verse 26, Jesus answered and said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, you seek Me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Here, He's calling them out on their motives. You're not following Me because you saw the signs and you want to be My disciples. You got your belly full, and now you want to come after Me. That's when He says in verse 27, Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set His seal on Him. You're putting your emphasis on the wrong thing. You're putting your emphasis on physical food. Don't labor for that. And that doesn't mean you don't ever work for food. We know that. He says, but in the spiritual realm, you labor for the food which endures to everlasting life. The bread that I will give you. Here's another parallel with Moses. In the wilderness, through Moses, God provided bread while they were wandering in the wilderness. The manna from heaven. And he's going to talk about that. Verse 28 it says, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" Jesus answered and said unto them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in Him whom He sent." So faith is a work. Faith is a work itself. Therefore they said to Him, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" What sign will you perform? He'd already performed an impressive sign that got their attention. They say, "Our fathers ate manna in the desert. As it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat," referring to Exodus chapter 16 and verse 4. Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is He," a person, "who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." He's going to take now the miracle that He performed that filled their physical need and say, what you need truly, that you don't understand you need, is spiritual food. And I am that spiritual food. Look at verse 34. They said to Him, "Lord, give us this bread always." Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." Now this is where they're getting confused. Because they wanted a king that could always provide for them. A benevolent king. And how often did kings of the ancient world provide food for the masses, and that swayed the audiences? I heard that some of the Caesars of Rome, the Roman emperors, when they would have their gladiator games, they would pass out bread to the people, free of charge. Well, of course, the people loved that. Free food. And they were hoping that would happen with Jesus. And Jesus said, you have a spiritual need. Your spiritual need is to have the bread of heaven. And He says, "But I said unto you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe." Verse 37. "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. I have come down to heaven not to do my own will, but the will of Him who sent me." Verse 39. "This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all He has given me I should not lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of Him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in Him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day." Now, He already talked about what kind of faith that is. It's a faith that works. Where He says, "This is the work of God," verse 29, "that you believe in Him who sent me." And He also talked about it being a faith that works in verse 27. "You labor for the food which endures to everlasting life." That's what you work for. So works are involved in true faith. The reason why I point that out is if you're ever talking to someone who believes in the faith alone concept, they'll always go to the book of John. But in the book of John, it defines for us what kind of faith saves. It's a faith that works. It's a faith that is a work itself. Verse 41 says, "The Jews then complained about Him because He said, I am the bread which came down from heaven." And they said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, the father and mother whom we know? Who is it then that He says, I have come down from heaven?" So they don't understand. He says in verse 48, "I am the bread of life. I'm the bread that comes down from heaven." Verse 51, "I am the living bread." This is all based upon the miracle of feeding the 5,000 with the bread. Then He talks about eating His flesh and drinking His blood, which is a metaphor of taking Jesus in. Not talking about the Lord's Supper here. We know that is a part of living the Christian life, but He's not establishing the Lord's Supper here. And we should not use these verses to talk about the Lord's Supper because He's using this symbolically. Other passages deal with the Lord's Supper, but not these. Then verse 60 says, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? And then you get down to verse 66. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Starts out with great multitudes, then ends with many people walking away. Do you see what happened here? When they realized the physical handout was gone, and they actually had to be dedicated to Christ, eat His flesh, drink His blood, dedication, commitment, be a true disciple, be a genuine follower, they didn't want that. They wanted a king who would provide for them physically. He provided for their needs, but they wanted a continuous handout. He said, no, I'm here to provide for your real need. It's spiritual. And when they realized that, that's not the king we wanted. That's not the king we were hoping to have. Therefore, multitudes walked away from him. You know, we see this in the church too, when we help out someone physically with something that they might have financial problems with, and we help them out because we do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. Galatians 6 and verse 10. But then they find out we're not going to continue to hand out. We'll help them find a job. We'll help them get on their feet. But we're not going to just continue to give them money, give them gas, they're not interested anymore. They don't want to have a Bible study, because every time we help somebody financially who calls us, I try to set up a Bible study with them, talk to them about their spiritual need, give them something spiritual to read. And a lot of them will talk the religious talk because they know they're getting some money. But when it gets right down to it, we tell them, come visit us. We'd love to have you visit us. Love to study with you. Your greatest need is spiritual. Not interested. Not interested. So, and this shows that human nature hasn't changed. What you see here in John 6, 2,000 years ago, is what we see with people today. You know why a lot of these denominations are so big? They have handouts. And what I mean by that, they provide things to the people that God never authorized to provide. Entertainment, all kinds of recreation. And they spend their money, and multitudes of money, on these things to get multitudes of people. And some brethren will do that too. And I've often wondered, if they stripped away everything, stripped away all the gadgets, the glitter, the instruments, and just practiced pure Christianity, how much smaller they would shrink in number as multitudes go someplace else. They're interested in the numbers and not in genuine Christianity. Any questions or comments about that? Many great lessons are found in John chapter 6. Let's look. We just don't have the time to get into this as far as the clock is concerned. The sixth miracle, we can touch on it. The healing of the man born blind. John chapter 9. You see how that, when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see how that Jesus healed people who had diseases, fevers, things like that. Then incurable things like leprosy. Things that don't happen. It's like a withered hand being restored. That doesn't happen. You know, a fever, someone naturally could get over a fever. Fevers were very dangerous back then. They're dangerous now, but we have a lot of medication. Fevers back then were very dangerous, could result in a death just like that. But if properly medicated and taken care of, a person could get over a fever. So someone could easily dismiss, he healed a fever. They couldn't dismiss the instantaneous nature of it. Can't dismiss that. But a fever you could get over. You don't get over dying. And Jesus raised the dead. You don't get over your hand being withered. Jesus restores it. You don't get over being born blind. That means that you have never had the capacity to see. And that's what you see here in John chapter 9. And notice they ask a question. We don't even have time to get into the miracle aspect of it, but they ask a very interesting question in John 9 verse 1. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. His disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Interesting, flawed theology they had. First of all, how can you sin before you're born? Do you notice the question? Did this man sin? That he was born blind? How do you sin before you're born? Maybe they believed in some sort of existence before birth for humans. That would, of course, not be true according to biblical teaching. But then they asked, did the parents sin that this man was born blind? Jesus said and answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. This man was born blind not due to his parents' sin or his sin. People are born blind, are born with defects, born with problems, because we live in a cursed realm. The earth was cursed way back there in the Garden of Eden, thousands of years ago, when man sinned. Cursed is the ground because of you, he said to Adam. Thorns and thistles will grow up. By the sweat of your brow, you're going to work now. Cut off from the tree of life. Cannot have that tree of life support system, so to speak. Therefore, man began to die. And so that's why people are born blind. We are suffering the consequences of Adam's sin. We don't suffer the guilt of it. We're not born guilty of Adam's sin, but we are born suffering the consequence of Adam's sin. Some more than others. Some are born with terrible conditions, and some are born very healthy. And he's saying here, this man nor his parents sinned. They did not sin. It's not their fault this has come about, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And he said these things. He spat on the ground, made clay of the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. He said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is this not the one who sat and begged? Now, I forgot to point this out with the other miracles, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Did you notice Jesus did not say to the multitudes, if you believe, I can provide food for you. But if you don't believe enough, if your faith isn't strong enough, I can't do it. No, it wasn't based on their faith. And notice here, it wasn't based on that man's faith. He didn't say to him, if you believe I can do this, then this will happen. And he did it in an unusual way. He spit on the ground, made clay of the spittle, the saliva, and anointed his eyes and told him to go wash. Then he came back seeing the miracle. This was a means through which he performed the miracle. It's been rightly pointed out that the means by which we are spiritually healed is to be immersed in water. This is no more mud healing than water baptism is water salvation. They accuse us of believing in water salvation. Well, was this mud healing? Was this spittle healing? Of course not. God did it, but He did it through a means. And He could have chose any way He wanted to, but He chose to do it various ways. The reasons we're just not told. Right. Exactly. He would go where people who were sick and heal them. How many times have you heard on the news of a Pentecostal preacher going and healing people in the emergency room? I never heard of that. Or going to the hospital and laying hands on people that are sick, visibly sick, and they come out well. I have challenged people who claim that they perform miracles by the power of God. I will take you in my car. Let's go down to the hospital. And you can lay hands on people. I want to see it. I'll record it on video. They won't do it. They won't do it. They won't take up that challenge. Why not? And they know that they don't really have that power. They know they don't. But this is, again, an example of Jesus not saying, if you have faith, this is the condition. You have to believe this will happen, or it won't happen, as they say. And Jesus heals this man in a different way than He healed other people. We'll continue our study of this next week, Lord willing.